Okay. Okay. Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Buenos dias. Thank you. Thank you all very, very much for joining us, and welcome to the Inter-American Dialogue. I'm Michael Shifter, the president of the Dialogue, and I want to take this opportunity to thank our distinguished speakers for today's conference, and also to thank the Dialogue's Energy Committee for its support of this event. Today's event will focus on the many challenges and opportunities to developing oil and gas resources in Latin America. The region holds extensive untapped resources, including new offshore finds in Guyana and Brazil, as well as shale plays in Argentina and Mexico. Colombia recently awarded new offshore exploration contracts, and Ecopetrol plans to develop a shale pilot project. There's a lot going on. Developing these resources could help countries reduce poverty by boosting government revenues and improve energy security by reducing imports and increasing exports. However, while the resource potential of Latin American countries is well understood, there are many above-the-ground risks that pose challenges for policymakers and companies. How can companies gain a social license to operate? To what extent are local and national politics interfering with sound energy policy? And what should governments do to distribute oil revenues to benefit all of its citizens? Today's discussion will start with a panel on Colombia's oil sector outlook, and we are honored to host two of the country's top energy sector officials. Our second panel will feature a group of distinguished experts on institutions, social and environmental impacts, and political risk related to energy in Latin America. I'll now turn this session over to Lisa Vicide, who will moderate. Lisa is, as you all know, the director of the Dialogue's Energy, Climate Change, and Extractive Industries program, and she has has a very, very active, dynamic, and wide-ranging program, and has had a series of events, and has done a terrific job. So let me turn it over to Lisa. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I want to thank my colleague, Nate Graham, for all his help in putting this together as well. Is it on? Okay. So I want to introduce our speakers. You have their full bios online, but we're very pleased to have, for this panel on Colombia, Diego Mesa Puyo. He is the Vice Minister of Energy of Colombia. And he has a long career as an economist. He was here in Washington for a number of years at the IMF, and he was also previously at PricewaterhouseCoopers in Canada. And he's taken as Vice Minister of Energy, he's taken a very important leading role in setting energy policy in Colombia. And I'm also very pleased to welcome Luis Miguel Morelli, the President of the National Hydrocarbons Association of Colombia. And he also has a long career in the oil industry. He worked at Ecopetrol, Occidental Petroleum, and he was also governor of Norte de Santander previously from 2003 to 2008, and has also played a very important role in kind of establishing Colombia's new direction with exploration and production. So I'm going to ask, I've asked each speaker to start off with a couple of minutes of kind of opening remarks, and then we'll have a Q&A discussion from there. So,
thank you. Thank you very much, Lisa and the Dialogue, for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here. I used to come here when I was in Washington to different events that you hosted, so thank you very much. I'm going to start with a quick introduction. I have about 5 or 6 slides to guide the discussion afterwards. So I'm going to be going through them, and then I'll pass it on to Luis Miguel, who can also give us more context on some of the specific issues that we've done. So we're going to be talking about the opportunities in the oil and gas sector in Colombia. And the idea here for the introduction is to tell you what we found when we came into office, what have we done in this 8 months of office, being in office, and where do we expect to go in the next 3.5 years that are left of this government. So in the oil sector, I mean, we have this strategy or, this roadmap in the ministry that basically guides all the different initiatives that we have. So we're always thinking in the energy spectrum, and as Lisa said, as energy vice minister, I have to look at the power sector and the hydrocarbon sector. So we're always trying to achieve, efficiency, which is thinking about, making the sector much more competitive, price efficiency, especially on the gas side, and thinking about making the system reliable, sustainable, and making sure that, we have energy security, which I think is obviously one of the main goals. So in the oil sector, I mean, we have a bit of an issue. When we came into office, we realized that Colombia, for the last 5 years, there were no one single EMP contract signed in 5 years. So obviously this was impacting seismic activity, which basically came down significantly over the last 5 years. Exploratory wells went down, investment in exploration. And that was obviously an issue because when we look at the reserves, even though Colombia is a marginal exporter, the sector is very important for the country. I mean, about between 15 to 20% of the fiscal revenues come from the oil sector. About 50% of total exports come from the oil sector. About 50% of FDI is from the oil sector. But when we look at reserves, we see a critical situation. We have between 5 to 6 years left of oil and between 10 and 11 years left of gas. And even the gas side, even though we have, 10 years left in the horizon, what we're saying is that by early 2022, we're going to have more demand than domestic supply. And that's an issue because we use gas for thermal generation. So obviously if we start importing all the gas, that's going to have a big impact in energy prices, in electricity prices. So we look at this and then we said, okay, well, we need to have a plan in place that's very quick, that has results soon. And we focus basically on, four angles. The first one is, to continue to promote exploration onshore. Most of Colombian production comes from onshore fields. Linked to that is try to have, incentives for enhanced oil recovery and incremental production of the mature fields. Then we also decided to promote aggressively offshore, the offshore basin in Colombia, which has been unexplored for many years. And finally, we have the option to develop unconventional resources. And I'll talk about this, very briefly. So what have we done? I mean, so the first thing that we did in December is that we passed this Finance Act in December 2018. And we wanted to have some incentives for industries that are capital intensive, such as oil and gas. And one thing we realized is that we were having some issues with VAT refunds in the sector. So the first measure that we introduced in that Finance Act was to make all the VAT paid in capital equipment for the sector 100% creditable towards corporate income tax. So that basically what it does is that, the VAT becomes an advance payment of the corporate income tax, and basically you don't have VAT. And we did the same for two other small taxes. One is the taxes on financial transactions. So that's 50% creditable for the next 2 years, and then 100% creditable after 2021. And for the ICA, which is a local tax as well. And in addition to that, we started a reduction of the corporate income tax rate, which was at 33%, or is at 33%. So it's going to be a gradual reduction towards 30% by the end of the term. So we think, those two, or those three measures are, a significant incentive for the industry. And we're already seeing, the impact of that. Then, and I'll let Luis Miguel talk about this later, but we also changed, the dynamics of how we assign areas. So we went from having this bidding rounds to a permanent bidding process, but I'll let Luis Miguel talk about that later. And then in the offshore, given that the potential of the offshore with all the Piston Core campaigns have been so successful, we decided to work on the model agreement for offshore exploration and production. We made some important changes, and we were able to sign 5 EMP contracts in the last couple of months. And these contracts have been signed with renowned companies such as ExxonMobil, Shell, Repsol, Ecopetrol, and lastly, we also have Noble Energy join as operator in one of the Shell blocks. We're also working on another 4 contracts. We hope to have 9 contracts by the by over the next couple of months. So the exploration of the offshore basin, the Atlantic basin, is now underway, and we expect to have, exploration campaigns starting as soon as, hopefully the first half of next year. And then finally, to wrap up on the unconventionals, the unconventionals, what we realize is that this could be the game changer for the Colombian oil and gas sector. So there's significant potential in the Median Magdalena Valley, in the Cesar department. And what we decided to do, given that this has been such a sensitive political issue, is that we form a commission of experts that work over the last 6 months, looking at all the potential risks from fracking, basically. And they've given us a report with very specific recommendations. And the recommendation is that we start with pilots. So I can, expand on this during the discussion. But what we're doing right now is internally as a government, we're looking at the recommendations, or we're designing a roadmap that we hope to make public relatively soon, in a few weeks, about how we should go about developing the unconventional resources. And I said this would be the game changer because what Ecopetrol and the other companies in Colombia have said is that if we develop, the 4 blocks that have been assigned for unconventionals, we were able to multiply by 3 or 4 the reserves, both on oil and in gas. That would also be, that would also go with an increase of 50% of production, give or take, significant increase in FDI, significant increase in fiscal revenues, and, will be self-sustainable from oil and gas perspective for the next 20, 50 years. So that's to summarize, and I'll pass it on to Luis Miguel, so he can give his introductory remarks.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Vice Minister, and thank you, Lisa, for the invitation, and all of you for being here. As the Vice Minister said before, we came on board less than 8 months ago, and we are in the way of changing or setting the reactivation of the oil and gas industry in Colombia. President Duque is very aware of the needs that the country has for new revenues, new income for social investment in Colombia, because the finance in Colombia has been complicated in the last years. President Duque found a country with less resources than the other presidents. So now we need to do a real reactivation of the oil and gas industry. So we realized that the industry has a sense of urgency for doing this reactivation. So at the beginning, as I told someone before, we started just updating the land map in Colombia. That was almost 2 years without having a land map. So the companies, the E&P companies, didn't have like a real idea where the country can offer areas for exploration and production. So, as Vice Minister said before, we had almost 5 years without signing any E&P contract. That means that the exploration activity in Colombia decreased so badly, and we needed to initiate like a new plan for it. So, first of all, we did the negotiation of the E&P model contract for offshore, opening a new line, because in Colombia we had some production in offshore, mainly gas by Chevron in two areas called Chuchupa and Ballena. But then we had been doing some very little exploration in offshore, but now we have opened so much the line of exploration in offshore with the 5 contracts that we already signed 1 month ago, and the other 4 that are in the process of signing with Anadarko as soon as we know the final result of the proposal from Occidental. I guess that maybe it's clear, it's going to be clear this week. So the idea is to have those 9 contracts ready to do a big exploration in offshore in Colombia. the commitments that the companies, those companies that Vice Minister show, are very close to $1.6 billion represented in those 9 contracts, but also in another contract called Tayrona Block, where Petrobras and Ecopetrol has agreed to commit with the additional exploration program, which means 2 new wells. They are going to drill 2 wells in the next 2 years for an amount of very close to $150 million. So the idea is to stir up as soon as possible the exploration in Colombia in the offshore, opening that new line. But also what we did immediately when we came on board is just to open the country for offers around all the basins that Colombia has. Usually Colombia used to offer areas or blocks in rounds, specific rounds for basins, but the idea of the new government is to have the land map really open for all the companies. So we said 2 months ago, like a permanent process of assigning areas, and we are just about to receive the first offers at the end of this month. And also the idea is to start signing contracts in July, or that means as soon as possible. We are offering the whole country, I mean, with the available areas, but also we are offering 20 blocks, 18 blocks in onshore and 2 blocks of offshore. Those blocks are areas that have been relinquished by the other companies and in other E&P contracts, but we have technical information, detailed technical information, and social and environmental information. So that's easier for the companies to see the data package and also to offer those blocks. But the main change here is that now companies can offer any polygon or any area that are desired, or in any basin that the companies want to offer for E&P contracts. So the idea is to have a competence among the companies where they have the same interest. If there is not the same interest for a block or for a polygon proposed, we are gonna just negotiate directly the contract with the proposed company, and then we are gonna sign the contract as soon as possible. So the idea is to reactivate the oil and gas industry, signing contracts, opening a new line of exploration like the offshore matter, and as the Vice Minister told you, opening also the unconventional projects that we are in the way. Colombia has a very robust legislation for exploration of unconventional. So what we need is just to clarify the matters with the Council of State, and the government is going to make a decision on this matter. And I think that we are going to have a very, very important increase of our reserves with the unconventional projects. As the Vice Minister said, it's almost 5 times the reserves that we have right now if we proceed with the unconventional project. So we have this new permanent assignment process, the offshore projects, the unconventional projects, and also we want to come to be like a real partner of the companies in Colombia, helping them to work in the areas in the territory where, you know, that it is sometimes it's complicated for some companies to carry out the commitment and to comply with the commitments of the contract. So that's the general idea, and the government of President Duque knows the sense of urgency that the industry has in Colombia, and we're in the way of giving the companies all the support to develop their exploration and production activities.
Thank you. That was very interesting. I have a few follow-up questions that I'd like to start with. Maybe I'll ask each of you a question. So, Mr. Mesa, let me start with you. I wanted to ask you about the environmental licensing process in Colombia. I think this has been kind of an ongoing challenge. Previously under the Santos government, the special environmental licensing agency was created within the Environment Ministry. You still have that agency, but you still hear about very long delays, contracts that were awarded where you might not see drilling for several years. Do you think that, what's the best process for environmental licensing to make sure, obviously there's a big concern of society. People want to be sure that, you're holding companies to the highest standards. How do you make sure you do that, but still have everything move forward as you want it to move forward? And what do you think things are improving in that sense?
Yes, I think things are improving. In fact, the environmental licensing agency, when they came in, they have so many processes that were accumulated over the last 4 or 5 years. And the current director, and we work directly with him very closely, I think now he went from having close to, I think the number was like 200 or 300 processes that were outside of the time, and he only has now 4 or 5. So he's very diligent in clearing this out, moving fast. One thing that we're doing is that we're working with him very closely, and trying to be proactive about the environmental licensing process. So if we know that a company has submitted a environmental license permit, and we know that the clock is ticking, we meet with them, and we make sure that, everything is in place for them to have all the different information that they need to make a decision. I think I saw, ConocoPhillips here in the room. I've been working with them on one of their license that is being significantly delayed. So I think that is improving. I think, they understand that we need to make sure that, they move with, a sense of urgency, as Morelli was saying before. But I think it's going well. And I think we're going to start next year basically with no delays whatsoever compared to the way we started in 2019. So the short answer is yes. I think it's big improvement. We reactivated one mechanism that wasn't working for the last 4 years, and we have something that is called a government industry accord. And we meet every 2 months, and we look, project by project, where the project is on environmental licensing, on consultas previos, which is this public consultation process, if there's any security issues. So we bring all the government entities into one room with the companies or with the Association of Petroleum in Colombia. And we try to make sure that we, clear bottlenecks. And I think that's, we've seen the results of that already.
Great, thank you. And Mr. Morelli, you were talking about the map of Colombia, where opportunities are, what areas you're talking to companies about, licensing. Is security, for years, security was a concern of companies in Colombia, and there are now areas that where the FARC has moved out. Not all the security issues have been resolved, but are you hearing that that's an ongoing concern, and are there new areas that are open because of the post-conflict?
Okay. In our breakfast this morning, we were talking about a little bit that the problems that the industry is facing in the territory is like the opposition of the communities more than the security problems. So one really good thing of this government, is the new government of President Duque, is that we have the instruction, the direction to articulate among all the entities within the government, Ministry of Interior, Ministry of Defense, Ministry of Labor, Ministry of Mines and Energy, Ministry of Environment. So for us, it's been really satisfactory when you see that the whole government is articulated, and we are coming to the territory you're just supporting the oil and gas companies. So now the Ministry of Defense and the Army and the police are really backing up all the processes within the territories, and the companies are seeing right now that they have the support of the high government or international government before the regions, before the municipalities and the state. So the idea is to, for example, the Ministry of Mines and Energy through the ANH to be in the territory doing all this support, this backup to the oil and gas companies, and I think that the companies already have seen the results of this matter. Here is Manuel Buitrago from Gran Tierra Energy, and he can tell the change that we are making in that matter.
Okay, thank you. Well, we can go ahead and open up to some questions from the audience, and I may have other follow-up questions. So please just raise your hand. I'm going to take a few in a row, and then you can respond to a group of questions. So here we have the microphone, and we'll take a question for you first. Please just introduce yourself and then ask your question.
Yes, my name is Nicolás Lloreda, and I'm a consultant, and I have two questions. First question is to Mr. Morelli, if he could talk a little bit about this small round or round for small producers that has also generated some interest. And I have a question for the Deputy Minister regarding interconnection. Will there be interconnection between Panama and Central America one day? Because Colombia has been hoping for so many years about this, and also to increase its interconnection with Ecuador and eventually Peru. Thank you.
Great questions. Thank you. Let's take one more. We have one over here.
We hope not forget the question.
I wrote them down. I'll remind you. Just one more.
Hello. Hi, I'm Patrick Wang, Human Resources Consultant with the IDB. I'm personal capacity here. Can I have two questions, please? The first one is a very brief one. So China has invested a lot in Ecuador and Venezuela in the oil sectors, but not so much in Colombia. And the rumor says there's a preference against China. So I want to know if there's a political motivation behind it. Secondly, with the existing companies in Colombia, specifically Emerald Energies, there's been several difficulties with communities, with the right to consultation, the indigenous people, and of course, what Lisa mentioned, the lengthy administrative and judiciary processes. I wonder if the government has any plans to improve it, especially the dialogue between the communities and the companies. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you. So it was a question about the mini round, the interconnection with Panama, and the China's role in investment in Colombia and dialogue with communities.
Right.
I guess.
Should I start with the question of Nicolas? You know, I mean, we told here what we had been doing with the new open permanent process to assign areas with the E&P contracts for offshore, also the unconventional projects. But as a complement of our policy in Colombia, we are in the process of evaluating the real situation of Colombia in the region. I mean, how competent we are to attract investment that comes, I mean, to South America, and we want to be like the best in the area. I mean, to receive that investment. And one of the matters that we have seen is that Colombia is very alike the United States in many matters, because we have at this moment small areas, small blocks for exploration and production. We have seen that, for example, between Ecopetrol and the ANH, we could have more than 200 fields, minor fields, that have discoveries, but haven't been developed because of the small size of the projects. There were fields with production of 200 or 300 barrels per day, which are not really economic for big companies like ConocoPhillips, Exxon, Ecopetrol, Oxy, or Shell. So the idea that we have in the new government is to make an inventory that we are in the way of doing it, an inventory of those fields, and we are also in the process that we started 2 weeks ago, and just to modify the regulation of Colombia that is contained in agreement number 2, Acuerdo 2 of 2017. So the idea is to have a new regulation that allows small companies, like with very experienced people, but and also with finance, to propose not only to reactivate the fields, the small fields or areas that are being with production, with the small production, but also to propose exploration projects, small exploration projects. So we would like to democratize or open the country also for the small companies like you see in Texas or in some parts of the States. I mean, small fields producing. And at this moment, the regulation in Colombia doesn't allow those companies to come down because of the requirements for the companies to be registered or habilitated in Colombia. So the idea is to open the country for those small investors and also to work in the regulation, which should be more flexible and should be more adequate for developing the investment into the contracts. Also, we have seen that in the last 6 years, the contract, the E&P contract, has been like increasing the obligations or the administrative matters, and it means more like a public work contract than an E&P contract, private E&P contract. So we are working also in that matter to get better terms for the companies.
Good. So I'm glad we're venturing into. So we're venturing into energy issues as well. Which I'm glad. So the first question with the interconnection with Panama, yes. So we've been working very closely with the Panamanian government that just, it's on its way out, but we managed to sign an agreement with them, because I think what was the reason why this wasn't going forward is because we were just, signing MOUs that were not binding. So now President Varela signed the agreement. We have the new route. We have the company, the Colombian Panamanian electricity company, and so it's going forward. And ISA from Colombia has been taking the lead on that, and that's going forward. With Ecuador, we've now importing about 7 gigawatts hour of electricity from Ecuador. We're increasing that to 9 gigawatt hour over the next year or so. So, that line has been very active, especially obviously during the El Nino phenomenon that we're on right now. I think the other question was about China. And the answer is no. I mean, there's no discrimination against China whatsoever. In fact, one of the main issues that we're trying to solve in this government that wasn't resolved over the last 8 years was the issue of Electric Caribe. Electric Caribe is an electricity company that distributes electricity to 25% of the Colombian population, and that was intervened by the government because it went bankrupt. And we're now doing roadshow to sell this company, and the first stop was China. So China's it's on the map. We're open for business. We welcome investment from any country. So just to be very clear about that. And the second question you asked was about communities. And we talked about this before at breakfast, but I think there are a number of different initiatives that we're doing right now. So back in 2012, in Colombia, there was a reform to how royalties are distributed to the different regions in Colombia. And what happened at the time was that, the producing regions used to receive most of the royalty income. That changed, and they went from getting 80% of the revenues, the producing regions, to about 20%. And that created a lot of issues. There's a lot of opposition now. And we're now trying to modify that. So there's an act. We need to reform the Constitution. So there's a process in place. We're having the debates right now. We would like to increase the 20% share that goes to the producing regions to a number between 30 and 50%, without affecting the non-producing regions, meaning that probably we're going to have less savings. But obviously we need to invest more in infrastructure, social infrastructure, and so forth. So that's one of the things we're doing, to make sure the communities are on board. Second issue is that the Constitutional Court ruled in October that, the communities no longer have veto power over extractive industry projects. And we think that it was very positive. So what they said now, what the court said, is that we need to coordinate and concur with the communities, but that doesn't mean that we need to get their approval. So now we're working on a mechanism to comply with what the court ruling said. And I think that's going to also, expedite a lot of the projects that were before on hold because they were waiting for popular consultation that no longer is constitutional. So we're working with the communities. I mean, I'm happy to talk about what the experts said on the report for Unconventionals, which is basically the communities have to be at the center of the discussion, and they have been. So we're making an effort to make sure the communities are involved in the whole process, but understanding that the resources in the ground belong to the state, and there's no community with veto power in Colombia anymore.
That's a very important issue.
Lisa, just to complement, in the China matter, we have two very successful companies in Colombia producing oil. Sinopec owns Emerald Energy and is producing a good amount of oil in Colombia. Also, with the Indian company, the ONGC Videsh, they own a company called Mansarovar that has a big production in the Middle Magdalena Basin. So we have a good amount of investment of the Chinese oil and gas companies in Colombia.
Interesting. Okay, well, let's go to the next question, right over here.
Hello, good morning. My name is Paola Carvajal from Arthur D. Little. My question is for the Vice Minister. Over the last 2 years, there was a big push for increasing the reliability of natural gas, and one of the big projects was the regasification project on the Pacific. We haven't heard much during this year, so I would like to know if that project is still in the pipeline for the government, and if not, if there is any other policies in place to ensure the reliability of the natural gas sector.
Thank you. And we could take another. I have a question over here.
Hi, thank you. My name is Chris Valdez, and my question could be for either of you gentlemen, and thank you for your insight, by the way, but you mentioned, Vice Minister, briefly that the government tender process has changed, I think in the last year. I think you mentioned to be a more permanent system, but if you could speak to that a little bit more, I'd appreciate that.
Okay, well, let's take one more question. Do you have right here?
Hi, Kirk Shore with Clearview Strategy Group. As you look at the competitiveness of the Colombian offshore, how do you benchmark yourselves against other countries in the region, say Guyana, Brazil, Mexico, and worldwide? Have you done that benchmarking process? And where does Colombia end up?
Thank you. Diego, maybe as you're going to answer the gas question, maybe also if you want to say anything about the renewables tender, give us a quick update.
Sure. So the regasification plant. So we have a bit of a conundrum with natural gas, and what happens is that in the short term, as I mentioned before during the introductory remarks, we're facing a possible shortage of gas in early 2022. However, in the medium to long term, there's a lot of potential for gas. We have the offshore, which, is highly gas prone, that is what the seismic has told us so far. And then we have the unconventionals. But we need to solve the issue. So the tender is going forward. I mean, is going, we think we're gonna be publishing the terms, maybe in the next 2 to 3 months. However, the regulator, which is the energy and gas regulator, Craig, and the planning unit, they're still fine-tuning configuration, size, and the most important thing is who's going to pay for the regasification plant. Because the question is, if we have a regasification like the one we have on the Atlantic coast, which is solely used for thermal generation, then it's very simple, who pays for that. But if we're going to be importing gas for domestic consumption, then we need to, make sure that we have a tariff that takes that into account properly. So we're still fine-tuning those issues, but the idea is that the regasification plant goes ahead. I mean, from an energy security point of view, it makes sense, the location, which is the Pacific, but the tender is going forward. The other question, I'll touch on the renewables now. So on renewables, we had an auction for unconventional renewables, so basically solar, wind, biomass, that didn't go well. Part of the reason for that was that, when we looked at the mechanism that we were setting up, which was a very competitive, transparent mechanism, that was competing against bilateral contracts that are a little bit opaque in Colombia. And so I think, the good news was that, we're able to realize a lot of issues with the regulation on the bilateral contracts that need to be fixed. However, even though that auction didn't go well, 2 days later, we had what we call the reliability charge auction, which is kind of like a capacity charge for energy sector. And that auction was very successful in 3 fronts. I mean, it was able to reduce the charge that we pay for having firm energy, reliable energy. Second is that it was oversubscribed, so we have many, many projects. And the third, which I think is the most important from the renewable side, is that for the first time in history, we had 8 renewable projects that received this charge. So we have 6 wind projects and 2 solar. So that basically eliminated this myth in Colombia that solar and wind are not able to compete with hydro and natural gas plants. So I think that's now, it's clear. So we're going forward with a new auction. We're working on the terms of the auction right now. We made some changes in the National Development Plan law that we passed in Congress last week. There are a number of incentives for renewables that we think are going to make them even more competitive. There's also the possibility to make sure that, like they do in most countries and in some of the states in the U.S., that, a portion of the energy that is purchased by the distributors comes from renewable sources. So we have that in the plan as well as another tool to make sure that this goes forward. And because this has been, a long debate. I mean, we've been trying to promote renewables, but not for the sake of promoting renewables, but because we've realized that the prices are much more competitive than what we thought they were. So one of the things, even though I'm not able to disclose the prices that we saw in that auction, one of the most frustrating things that happened with that auction is that the prices that were bid by the generators were significantly lower than what the spot price is in the energy sector in Colombia, and they were significantly lower than what we see companies contracting on the bilateral market. So there are reasons why the distributors didn't come to this auction. I mean, there are pervasive incentives on the bilateral markets that allowed some of the distributors not to pass through any savings to consumers. So there's, an economic rent that is generated, and we want to make sure that we clear that up and we have a much more transparent process.
Thank you. Go ahead. Do you want to respond the benchmarking question? How do you see Colombia comparing with other countries in the region?
Okay. And the other question, but I'll let that Luis Miguel answer that, is I think it was a question about the permanent process of assigning of areas. And, basically, I mean, the way I summarize this is it's kind of like an open door policy with a competitive factor built into it, because and Luis Miguel can explain this better, but, basically what we do is that any company can come and make a bid for a block. But once that bid is made, other companies have the opportunity to, compete against that bid. So even though it's kind of like open door policy, there's competition element. But I'm sure you'd like to expand a little bit more on that.
Yeah, in that matter, the difference is that we are going to have a permanent process during the whole year, receiving, the registration of the companies, and then like a window for presenting the offers in two highways. One is the open land map that we have for the companies to propose their areas, polygons, or also their interest in any basin of Colombia. And the other highway is the 20 blocks that we offer with technical, environmental, and social information specific that we have recovered during the years at the ANH. So the idea is to have both, blocks offered by the ANH and also the land map open to all the companies to present their interests. But the good thing is that we are going to have a permanent process during the whole year. If we receive an offer, there will be a window also for the counter offers and have a very transparent and competent process during the whole year.
On the benchmarking, do you want to touch on that? Or sure. On the benchmarking, I think the best way to benchmark is with results. So yes, we're competing with Guyana, which, probably has a very favorable fiscal terms. So from a fiscal point of view, I think we've made some changes that are now, showing results. So, I mentioned before, decreasing the corporate income tax rate, the VAT issue, but we also need to look at other non-fiscal issues. So, we have a highly skilled labor force, in Colombia. We've been producing petroleum for 100 years. And I think, one thing that shows that we're competitive against, Guyana, Mexico, even Trinidad or across the Atlantic, with Ghana, is that we've been able to sign these 5 contracts. So we've made changes to the model contract agreement, which, Mr. Morelli, addressed before. And the fact that, so quickly we're able to get 5 contracts signed, and we have 4 more that are in the pipeline. That shows that, competitive wise, I think we're doing quite well. I wouldn't be able to tell you, in the wrong quarter, where do we stack. But I think, the competitiveness of the sector with the reforms that we did in the Finance Act in December 2018, plus the changes that we've done to the contract, to the model contract agreement, are now showing results.
Thank you. Well, we're going to have to move on to the next panel, but I want to thank you. It sounds like, things are really progressing a lot, and there are really a lot of changes happening in energy and oil sector policy that sound like things are on track and very promising. So thank you very much for coming here and talking to us about this today. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I would like to go ahead and introduce our next panel, which will talk about a range of countries in the region and some of the challenges that were brought up in the opening remarks. So I'd like to introduce Julie Evans, who's the Environmental and Social Manager for the Americas region at RENA Consulting, and she has a lot of experience carrying out environmental and social impact assessments for energy projects. Lenin Balsa is an economist in the Extractive Industries Initiative at the Inter-American Development Bank, and he's been working a lot with Guyana on their institution building. And David Maris is professor of political science at the University of California, San Diego, and he looks a lot at kind of political risk issues, which is what he's going to focus on today. So I've asked each person to start with about 5 minutes of initial remarks, and then from there we'll go into some questions. So Julie, would you like to start?
Thank you, Lisa, for having me. I see two challenges for moving forward the energy resources. One is community expectations, and the other one is, the length of time that that environmental impact assessments take for approval, which I think we talked before. In terms of the community expectations, I had the opportunity to go to Guyana last summer, and interview many community members, Amerindians, stakeholders from the civil society, NGOs, government officials, employees, and they all had the expectation that the oil discoveries were going to bring thousands of jobs, and that's really not the case. I mean, that's something that I think companies and the government should work together to, have a stakeholder engagement plan that is that always monitor where the expectations are going ahead of reality, and see this engagement with communities as a risk management tool rather than a requirement by the agency that approves the issues or environmental impact assessments. The other challenge is, as you mentioned before, Lisa, is the length of time that the agencies take for approval. And sometimes it can go from a year and a half to 2 years. This is for two reasons, I think. One is that the agency that is in charge of approval these assessments don't have the resources. They are not empowered. Sometimes they don't have the staff that work in those agencies don't have the experience or the technical knowledge to review environmental impact assessments. For instance, fracking now, an environmental person who reviews the assessments may not know what involves that project. And the other one is that sometimes companies, when they go to the field, don't want to invest at the beginning. And I think in environmental personnel and environmental resources within the company, they should do that from the get-go, in my opinion. And I've been watching SENACE, which is Servicio Nacional de Certificaciones Ambientales in Peru. What they've done in the past is now they are the agency that reviews all issues from various sectors, and what they're doing now is that they're actually accompanying the sponsor of the company in every step of the issue development. So they meet with the reviewers. The company meets with the reviewers, and then the environmental specialists within the agency actually go to the field with them. So they go to review the methodology. They go to do the baseline assessments in the field. I mean, in Peru, the jungle mainly. And so they go and do the biodiversity assessments, the social consultations, etc. So in that way, they are basically walking with them every step of the way. So when it's time to submit the ISHA, the agency who's going to approve already knows the project. So it doesn't come to a surprise. And that process is now taking 6 months instead of a year and a half. So I think it's a positive example. I'm monitoring it closely because it's fairly new. So that's, those are my 2 cents. Thank you. You have one.
Hello. Okay. Thank you, Lisa, for inviting me and having me here. I'm going to try to provide some insights about the oil and gas situation in Guyana, where I'm leading the deployment of the technical assistance package for the IDB related to the oil and gas sector. And let me start by, back in 2015, a consortium led by ExxonMobil that also includes Hess and Ness, which is a fully owned subsidiary of China offshore oil company, made some discoveries. As of today, that amount of around 5 billion oil barrels, which by any measure it's huge. That is a game changer for the oil and gas industry and especially for Guyana. You know, at the IDB, we have been working closely together with the government of Guyana in building and designing a new set of institutions to govern the oil sector. As of today, the development of the oil and gas sector in Guyana is governed by a production sharing agreement contract. It's a super standard PSA contract. It's after cost recovery. It's a 50-50 share. The thing is like this is completely new to the country. The country have never been an oil producer before, so they do not have the capacities and the capabilities to manage and oversee this sector. They have a Petroleum Act back from 1986, which only covers a very few basic parameters for the oil sector. So that means that they need to build an entirely new set of skills and entities to be able to supervise and monitor the oil and gas sectors. Back in August last year, the government of Guyana decided to create a Department of Energy, and it was tasked with the responsibilities to oversee and manage the oil and gas sector. But it means that they need to develop all the capacities that they do not have. And that is where, you know, institutions like the IDB, World Bank. I met Diego when Diego was still working at the IMF, and Diego was one of the leaders of the technical assistance program from the IMF to Guyana. So it's extremely important that the development community and international organizations work together to increase the capacity of the government of Guyana to make this happen, right? Because at the end of the day, these discoveries are posing tremendous challenges, not only from an economic perspective and physical perspectives, but also from an environmental point of view. So, you know, it's supposed, I mean, oil production is planned to start next year at around of above 100,000 barrels per day. That is a figure equivalent to 90% of GDP. Our colleagues at the IMF estimate that it could have an impact of around 40% only next year in Guyana. So that is huge. So the question is the country ready to face this challenge, or how they are going to overcome the challenge that the oil and gas industry is posing on the country? So I think that we can talk a little bit more about how the IDB. We have several instruments, technical assistance package, also some investment loan and a policy-based reform loan that is linked to the development of a new regulatory framework for the oil and gas sector in Guyana. But I always remember one of my mentors used to tell me something that is still applicable for the case of Guyana. We need to stop telling weak countries to build robust institutions. That is the same thing as telling an insomnia to get more sleep. We need to be practical. Telling a weak country to build capacity and to build institution is nothing. So that is how the IDB is taking a different approach here, and we are just building blocks step by step, trying to get probably in the long run. Maybe Guyana will have a regulatory framework that may look like Colombia. I think that Colombia is a good example of getting of how a good institution can shape the oil sector. But at the beginning, maybe Guyana is going to just have, minimum capacity to be able to deal with such an important consortium that is led by ExxonMobil. Okay.
I'm sort of the odd man out here, being a political scientist, although I do work in the sector. But if Okay. If we look at potential and we have a little sense of what's going on, we say again, because Latin America's had potential for a long time in resources. Right? And the challenge, the above ground challenge, really is to devise a way in which the development of that potential is sustainable. Because it seems like every so often you develop the potential and you develop it in a way that degenerates into a total mess domestically. It can't deal with international fluctuations, and it makes it more difficult the next round that you try and come up with. So let me give you a couple of examples. If we were in the 90s, we'd be talking about Venezuela and the great potential in Venezuela. And Venezuela did great. Oil production went up dramatically as the people went deeper into poverty. That's not a sustainable approach. The question is, how do you generate investment in the natural resource sector in a way that can deal with market fluctuations, but that also can deal with the political needs of a society to benefit from that resource. It's not sufficient to say, well, the country benefits. GDP goes up, but as we saw in Venezuela, at the end of the 90s, poverty also went up. Okay, that's not a solution. Okay, it's not just Venezuela. This happens in lots of countries around Latin America. You know, part of the reason why AMLO is so successful is because EPN had a great, Peña Nieto, had a great run with the energy reform, okay, at the same time that more and more Mexicans were feeling that they were getting left out. Okay. If we look at the development of these sustainable energy policies, what we see are two things need to happen. Right? For communities to have confidence that the agreements that are being signed will actually benefit them. Okay? Companies need to be more engaged. Okay? Companies need to be more engaged with communities. Companies need to be more careful about not short term, but about medium and long term. Okay, because you make a great short term contract, it's clearly not going to be sustainable as soon as there's a change in government, as soon as market prices go up, etc. All right, so companies need to be thinking about, yes, profit. Okay, obviously companies need to make a good deal, but they can't make a great deal at the expense of the countries. Because the resource does not belong to the state. The resource belongs to the nation, not the state. The state's the government. And the communities get angry because they don't get the benefit of it. You know, it's not sufficient to say if we had good institutions. We have an institutional change so that in some countries, Colombia we just heard, okay, communities don't have a veto. Okay, well, we can go to Peru and look at the mining sector, look at the natural gas areas, and yes, the communities may not have a veto, but they're out there blocking the roads, and the investors are having a real problem getting a return on their investment because the communities which don't have a veto, nevertheless, are not bought in. Okay, so one needs to think beyond the rules and the institutions there, because those will change with politics. And they need to think about how do you get actually the community buy-in. Whether legally they have veto power or not is a secondary question. It really is, you know, this process, this environmental thing was sped up so that in 6 months it's approved, but it better be a good agreement that's approved, because if you get a pipeline that starts leaking, you know, a year and a half after it was approved, that's a real problem for the next pipeline and for the next sped up environmental license. So the challenge, the above ground challenge really is for companies and governments to work together to bring benefits, not to, quotes, the nation in some abstract term, but to, in particular, the people who are living in the areas where you need to get the resource. The rest of the country will benefit when that resource comes out, but if the people in the area don't benefit, you won't be able to get the resource out. Then you won't have energy security, and you won't have GDP growth, et cetera, et cetera. So I see that, and I'm, and I'm willing to go into more detail in question period. But to throw that out as a question, all right? The real challenge is for governments and companies to work together on a long-term process.
Thank you. Well, I think you're right. It's not just solving the issue legally. If you don't have community support, is not going to resolve things. But I think the government knows that, and that's one of the reasons they're focused on, in Colombia, I'm referring to, the change in the revenue, the revenues that you're giving to communities, because then you're actually trying to give something directly back. Let me ask you each a follow-up question. I'll go in reverse order. So David, following up on your point, let's talk about Brazil. And maybe more broadly, the trend. I think there was obviously a trend toward resource nationalism, as it's often called. And then more recently, I think there's been a trend more toward market-oriented approaches. Do you think in Brazil, which direction, do you think that we're really moving in the direction where, the policies will be more determined by the market? Or do you think this issue of the resources are for the people will resurge? And, how do you see, and considering that Bolsonaro had to reverse the idea of being able to raise diesel prices in line with market, there's a little bit of a sign that maybe could be a populist government if he felt that he couldn't keep diesel prices in line with international prices and had to sort of roll that back. Do you foresee a return to those types of policies?
All right. Well, I don't like the use of the term resource nationalism, all right, because it really doesn't tell us anything. We just label something we don't like resource nationalism. I mean, let's look at Brazil more closely. Already with Dilma's government, PT government, all right, they were already beginning to talk about changes that were necessary because the changes that they had done in 2010 with Lula turned out not to be sustainable in the market. Had the market been going where it was, it wouldn't have been a problem, all right? So it's not so much whether the government is involved in this, it's the ability of the government and the companies to adjust in those changes, in those market changes, and in political changes. Bolsonaro is responding in a way that Temer wanted to respond, but couldn't get the votes to. In fact, Temer made some of the changes that Bolsonaro's actually implementing. If the advantage that Brazil has is that the political situation in Brazil, no one party dominates. Bolsonaro doesn't have a party. Okay, he's got to make the deals in Congress to get legislation through. Okay, if you're AMLO in Mexico or Chavez in Venezuela, you can push through your ideas, your party's ideas, and nobody can. But Lula couldn't do that. He had to make deals. And that's why when they did the pre-salt changes, okay, Lula's pre-salt changes didn't look like what AMLO wants or what like Chavez did, even though Lula was, quotes, a resource nationalist. So I think that what we need to think about is, can Bolsonaro's national development strategy deliver for the people who are at the bottom, didn't vote for him, all right, but he got in because people were upset not with resource nationalism, but people were upset with the corruption in the political system, and he's the outsider who came in. Now, if he doesn't deliver, okay, if corruption doesn't go down, if growth doesn't go up and is distributed, he's not going to be around for a second term, and, he doesn't have a party, so we don't know who would be there. The PT could come back in. But it'll be a PT that's got to operate in this political environment, and you might go a little more towards more government intervention, but you're not going to go to the extremes of what we see AMLO's trying to do, what Cristina was able to do in Argentina. Why? Because the Peronista party really has a grip on that legislature, and through that legislature on the courts and on the bureaucracy. Those are the problems with the governments that, quotes, intervene in the market. I mean, when I see a government that doesn't intervene in the market, that's not an economic decision. That's a political decision. The government has political support to let the market operate more. So then the question is, well, why does that government have political support for that? And usually what you see is because, in fact, there's less corruption, there's more distribution, not just to state governments, not just to a municipal cabecera, but actually out to the little communities out there that are on the road to the big mining project or the big gas project.
Right. And Lenin, I have a question about Guyana, if you've been looking at this. I think that there are big plans for what to do with the revenue from this and the resources. I guess I have two questions. One is, what is the deal with the Sustainable Development Plan? I mean, it's very general from what I've seen, but it basically, one of the things it says is that they want to have 100% renewable energy by 2025. I think they have no renewable energy now and are mostly reliant on oil-fired power generation. But there's also a broader statement in there about we want to have this oil wealth, but we want to have a sustainable future. And then there's also a lot of discussion about how to build the industry. You know, as Julie said, it doesn't bring that many jobs, but it also brings a lot of services. Are they talking about having local content rules? You know, so what do you think about those two questions?
Thank you, Lisa. Yeah, there are like several questions in the same question, but yeah, I mean, let me start by saying the PSA contract that was signed between the consortium and the government of Guyana was signed to develop the Stabroek field, and there is the Stabroek block, and there is one field that will start produce oil next year. That is Liza 1. If you look at the expected revenue that probably the government is gonna get over I would say the next 20 years, only Liza 1, we are talking about order of magnitude between $8 to $12 billion just in Liza 1. There are many other fields within the Stabroek block that will produce later on, and it will increase the amount of money that the government of Guyana is gonna get. So yes, it's important to put in place a new set of entities that will be able to manage that amount of money. As a matter of fact, back in January, the government of Guyana approved a new legislation for a natural wealth fund to manage those resources. That is one key feature. The other one, it's related to, let's say, the direct impact of the oil exploitation. That is true, given that this is offshore production, that is like almost 200 kilometers away from the country coast. You are not going to get like too many spillover effects on the real economy through the oil exploitation itself. But you are going to get a lot of spillovers along the value chain, probably on oil services, or maybe basic services in the country. But also the question is, what are you going to do with those resources, right? So then you are going to have, when you use those resources, maybe through a saving fund or a stabilization fund that will finance, I don't know, infrastructure projects, then you are going to have some real impacts on the economy. So again, it's important that the government speed up the process of building those set of key entities that they need to effectively and benefit from the oil and gas sector. And then the second part of your question was
about the sustainable development.
And sustainable, yeah. The other leg of oil exploitation is the associated gas that you are going to get from oil exploitation. And there is an ongoing discussion of bringing onshore the associated gas. And then I know that they have a target by 2025, 2030 to become like a country with 100% of renewable energy. So If they manage to bring onshore that gas, they can use the gas to transition to the renewable energy. It takes some time, probably more than 2030, but I don't think that developing the oil and gas industry in Guyana, it's not compatible with, changing the energy matrix of the country, especially if you think about gas as a transition fuel. I think it is totally doable in the long run.
Right, great. Well, and Julie, I wanted to ask you about Mexico. It was very interesting what you said about the social environmental impact assessment process. In Mexico, it's kind of a unique case because they've always had a state monopoly, so everything was done by Pemex, including relations with communities, where the company was known nationally and loved by most people, I guess. And then also, same with the environmental impact. And now you have new operators, companies that have never been there. You have to have a different process. Do you think that the institutions have been in place, the processes? Do you think Mexico's on track? Even with things slowing down and there being no new licensing rounds, there's still many contracts that were signed and companies that were coming in. And so you still have all these new players. How do you think that's working?
I think it's going well, considering that ASEA is the institution that, belongs to the Ministry of Environment and is in charge of the sector. ASEA was formed or was thought as let me step back. It was originally thought to be dealing with risk. So the thought of the regulators was, okay, let's put this institution together to deal with the risk associated with the sector, because it's a sector that, it's the risky operations. So let's deal with the risk, and then let's have this institution within the Ministry of Environment to kind of consolidate all permitting that has to be associated with it. So I think that's a good idea. I think it's a slow process, but I think it's moving forward. Yeah.
Great. Well, we have a couple minutes for questions from the audience, if we have any. Here's a question.
Emil Sunley. My question relates to...
Could you introduce yourself?
Okay, Emil Sunley, retired from the International Monetary Fund. My question relates to Guyana. You talked about institutional building by small incremental blocks, and this production sharing contract is one of those where the income tax is paid out of the government share. And this often has led to problems about what role does the tax authority have, what role does the energy ministry have in administering the production sharing agreement, particularly relating to allowable costs. Has that been worked out in Guyana?
We can take one more question. We had one here.
Hi, good morning. My name is Mary Borlick. I'm formerly with the State Department Energy Bureau, and my questions also have to do with Guyana. So I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about the specific building blocks that the IDB is looking at putting in place in terms of your technical assistance work. Second, to what degree is there already some coordination taking place among donor agencies on all the technical assistance and sort of work that needs to be done? And then third, on the political side, maybe for you perhaps, do you see any spillover effect from developments in Venezuela and elsewhere in the region, specifically on what is, taking place in Guyana in terms of their oil and gas development?
Thank you. I don't know if you had your hand up first, whatever. Okay. I'm Carmen Iribarren, and I'm from Venezuela. I'm glad somebody eventually spoke about Venezuela. I would like to refer my question to the Guyanese expert from the IDB. We have a zona de reclamación for many years. In fact, my uncle, who was a diplomat a long time ago, etc., negotiated that with Guyana back in the 1960s. Are any of these projects, etc., in the zona de reclamación? That's a major issue, especially considering the disaster in Venezuela.
Okay, let's start with Lenin. And Julie, I know you also have a lot of experience in Guyana, so please also give your comments.
Yeah, thank you for all the questions. Those are great questions. I'm going to start by saying something. Full disclosure, I'm Venezuelan. No, it's fine. And I have an anecdote that I can share maybe some other time while working in Guyana. But anyway, let me start by the first question. I think it's true what you said. As a matter of fact, I think it will be key for the government of Guyana putting in place a set of protocols for managing the PSAs. Those are still not in place. So there are no guidelines to manage the contract itself. And that is key for the government of Guyana to put those procedures and guidelines for managing the PSA agreement in place before oil production starts. Because as you were mentioning before, it's going to be key for the country to increase the capacity to actually being able to do the cost audit, especially because the PSA contract is a cost recovery contract. So that means that the 75% of the revenue, of the 75% of the production share will be allocated to cost recovery, and then the 25% will be split equally. But the country needs to have the capacity to have the cost audit, because the consortium is going to invoice the country. So here is the cost that I have made before. So you need to recognize that. So putting in place a new set of protocols and procedures to manage the PSA is key. And that's exactly what the IDB, together with other donors, has been working together with the Department of Energy to put in place, for instance, key minimum capacities within the government to be actually to oversee the sector. The second question regarding I think that somehow is related to coordination among different multilateral development institutions and other donors. We do have a monthly coordination meeting with the World Bank and other donors in country, where we try not to duplicate efforts, because we do recognize at the IDB that many institutions are working on the sector as well. So we try to coordinate as much as possible and work together in many areas where we are actually working together to avoid duplication of efforts, but at the same time making the support to the country more meaningful and impactful. I don't know if you. Yeah, I mean, it's hard. Regarding, I don't know, if there is a change in regime in Venezuela, I think that there is a potential benefit for each country, because I will say the type of crude that is going to come out from Guyana can be easily refined in Venezuela eventually. So, if things change at some point, I think that both countries can mutually benefit. And last but not least, regarding the question about the zona de reclamación, as you mentioned it before, yes, we do recognize that at the IDB, that there is a zona de reclamación. Still, if you look at the where the Stavro block is located, the Stavro block is where la zona where the oil fields are located, and especially the ones that has been found where they have oil. Those are located far away from what the zona de reclamación is. So I will say, at least at the beginning, the oil coming from Liza 1 might not be necessarily in dispute, but still that is an issue, and that's a well recognized international discussion that might be an issue at some point. But as of today, all the fields that has find where they have oil, those are well located, far away from what is on dispute. Let me put it that way.
Do
Given that the Guyanese political system is imploding. What is the confidence that the bank feels about the kinds of agreements that you're generating with the government in place? I mean, are you having discussions with the opposition about what do they support for this? Looking ahead as Guyanese politics sputters along, what do you see?
You can answer and then I'll ask you the question.
Thank you for your question, David. The IDB, it's a multilateral development bank. From a technical, our technical assistance packages focuses on, providing technical assistance to the country. We are focusing on the minimum technical aspect that any government, the current government or future governments, needs to have in place to oversee and monitor the development of the oil and gas sector. So, regardless of the political economy situation, we do know, everyone knows the political economy of the country is complex. But we work closely together with our government counterpart, the Department of Energy, to guarantee that at the technical level, they do have what is required to monitor and supervise the development of the oil and gas sector.
And Julie, you told me the other day that you've also been going to Guyana, and I guess you're looking at the environmental aspects of the projects, or could you tell us what you're seeing?
Yes, well, I was there last summer for, actually hired by the IDB to look at the strategic social and environmental assessment for a possible port, deep sea port, so the northern states of Brazil could take the products to the Atlantic. So because of that project, we did a lot of stakeholder engagement and also, we basically canvass the countries. It's a small country, so we did a lot of that. And well, as I said, one of the findings is like the country is a little bit like it has two main populations. One is Guyanese that are African descendant, and the other group is Indian descent. And sometimes they go from they change in offices in power. And I think it needs to be a little bit more of someone needs to sponsor that cohesiveness of both ethnic populations. The other thing is that in the international, I was a follow-up question for him among the international agencies. We were trying to interview the international agencies that are trying to help Guyana with this. And we actually didn't get too many responses. Well, only the IDB was sponsoring this. But my question to you is the USAID involved on this at all? Or?
Well, let me just, Diego, did you want to ask the last question? And then, because we're going a little bit, did you still have a question?
It's on Guyana too, so we can wrap it up there. I'm gonna. My question is, the been questions about community, about how to handle a fiscal regime, but I was interested in what is the process in place to manage the revenues. So to put things into perspective, Guyana has less than 1 million inhabitants, and they're going to be producing within the next 5 to 10 years, close to 1 million barrels per day. And Exxon keeps announcing every other month, another billion barrels discovered. Where is Guyana now on that front? You have absorption capacity issues, capacity building issues, and they were thinking about a fund, a spending rule. How can you ensure that you don't repeat the same mistakes that, the international community, made with East Timor, for example? So I would be interested in learning about what's going on there.
Do you want to just briefly answer? You have to wrap it up.
Thank you, Diego. I really appreciate the question, and you might have a better answer than I have because you know the counterpart very well. The truth is all the donor communities still working closely together with the government. As a matter of fact, the World Bank have a loan operation that includes within one of the policy commitments to disburse the second tranche of World Bank operation. a sovereign wealth fund needs to be in place for them to execute the second tranche of that operation. So that means that at some point that is like a commitment from the government if they want to get the budget support from the World Bank. Still, we do recognize even though if they manage to put in place a sovereign wealth fund or a natural wealth fund, whatever you want to call it, that is not a silver bullet, you know? And that is what is important to put as many commitments, as many, not only a sovereign wealth fund, but, you know, another set of institutions that can create a check and balance within the system to guarantee that what happened before in other countries, even with the support of the international community, doesn't happen in Guyana. And I think that is in the best interest of everyone. But sweet and short, we continue to work closely together with the government of Guyana to guarantee that they put in place a set of institutions for that.
Thank you. Well, I know we've gone over a little bit, but thank you everyone for joining us today. Great discussion. Thanks a lot.